Hi, I'm Jim Steyer. I'm the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, and we're here today for a very important conversation about one of the most important issues facing our nation, and that is the youth mental health crisis that is shaping the lives of so many children and families here in our country. And our guest today is Dr. Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General of the United States, who is probably the most articulate and thoughtful expert on issues related to youth mental health in this country. He's spoken to audiences all across the country, and his words of wisdom are incredibly important for all of us, whether we're parents, educators, community members, or young people ourselves. So welcome, Dr. Murthy.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Me too. So tell us how you first got interested, both as Surgeon General, but also as a parent, in the issues of mental health in the United States, and particularly the youth mental health crisis that we're experiencing today. And why do you feel it is of such concern to communities all across the country?
Well, Jim, as a young person, I struggled a lot with my own mental health. You wouldn't have put it in those terms when I was young because I didn't really know how to think about mental health. And at the time, I was struggling with a combination of loneliness and anxiety, even in retrospect, probably some depression as well. But I didn't really know how to think about it, much less how to talk to someone else about it. And then I felt this profound sense of shame around it and embarrassment. I know, fast forward many years, and I realized many of the kids I was growing up with in school were also feeling something similar, but we didn't know that at the time. So that was certainly in the back of my head. And when I served as Surgeon General during the Obama administration, I had the privilege of going around the country and talking to people in communities across America, and parents across the board were telling me that they were worried about the mental health of their kids. And they were confused, for example, about what they were supposed to do. They didn't understand a lot about the technology their kids were growing up with, but they knew that and could sense that it was having an impact on their kids' mental health. And so this was coming up in conversation after conversation. And as I dug into the data around it, I came to see that this mental health crisis we have among youth has been building and accelerating for a number of years now, even prior to the pandemic, where in the decade, in fact, prior to COVID, we had a 57% increase in the suicide rate among young people. We now have about half of young people who are saying they feel persistently sad or hopeless. One way to think about it is like this. If you had a high school with 1,000 kids in it, right now in America, 450 of those children are saying that they feel persistently sad or hopeless. 200 of those children have thought about taking their own life, and 100 of those kids have actually attempted suicide. This is the state of mental health when it comes to kids in America right now. And that's why when I had the privilege of coming back to serve as Surgeon General again, I made mental health and well-being my top priority. And last year in December 2021, we issued a youth mental health advisory to call the nation to attention because this is a crisis. But there's the good news is there's a lot we can do about it to expand access to treatment, invest in prevention, and fundamentally change the conversation so that no young person ever has to feel ashamed for needing help.
So I'm the father of 4, and listening to you, I'm actually thinking of my own children, all of whom are in the age range, and I would agree that in one way or the other, even though they've been very privileged in their upbringing, have gone to great school, et cetera, they've all wrestled with mental health issues as well. And I say to them, we're in a crisis state, and when we travel around the country like you do, people refer to it as a crisis. When you do, let's talk a little more about what we're seeing before we get into the solutions. What would you describe as the most visible manifestations of the mental health crisis that young people are facing in this country?
That's a good question, and I think of it this way. Our mental health is the fuel that allows us to show up in life, to show up in school, at work, for our friends and family, and in our communities. When we struggle with our mental health, it affects all of those areas, right? So it affects how we interact with our family and friends. We may get more withdrawn. Some people react to mental health struggles by being quiet and withdrawing. Others react differently by lashing out, or getting angry or being short-tempered. So we're all a little bit different in that regard. But we also have seen that when young people struggle with their mental health, it can impact their performance in school, and it can impact how they perform in the workplace. If they're a young adult and they're already in the workplace, it can impact their productivity negatively. And so one key thing to know is that the effects of poor mental health are widespread, but they're also very different, which is why it's so important for us to tell parents and others and to tell young people that you can't just look at somebody and know how they're doing in terms of their mental health. in part because we've all become experts in putting on a facade and making it seem like everything's going great. We especially do that on social media. So you especially can't tell when you look at someone's social media feed how they're actually doing, which is why it's so important for us to actually check on one another, because don't assume that just because someone has happy posts, online, that somehow everything is going well in their life. When you peel back the curtain, most people are struggling in some way, shape, or form. Finally, I'll just say this. If you're a parent out there and you're thinking, how do I know if my kid is struggling? Like, what signs should I look for? Recognizing the diversity of signs, what I would look for are changes in patterns. Is your child not sleeping well, whereas before they were sleeping soundly? Have their eating patterns changed? Have they been reluctant or less likely to hang out with friends or with family members? Are they becoming more withdrawn? Has there been a reluctance on their part to participate in activities that used to give them joy, like hobbies or sports? And has their academic performance suffered? Because that can be a sign as well. Any changes like that mean that it's important to pause, to have a conversation with your child, to reach out for help from others if you need to, like your child's doctor or counselor in school.
And you said that basically 50% of all young people today in the United States are experiencing some form of anxiety, depression, really, really heavy level of stress, correct?
Yeah, so the studies that show around 50% of high school students, close to it, about 44% specifically, are feeling persistently sad or hopeless.
Okay.
And look, this is at a time where we hope that high school, even though it's not easy, we hope it's a time where people are feeling optimistic about the future. They're looking forward to the rest of their lives. And if nearly half of students are telling us they're not feeling that way, that's deeply, deeply concerning.
Deeply concerning. Let me ask you a question about the pandemic, because I remember you and I were having conversations about this pre-COVID-19 and pre your returning as the Surgeon General of the United States. How do you think the pandemic impacted the youth mental health crisis in the United States?
Well, I think the pandemic did several things when it came to youth mental health. One is it increased the number of stressors on young people. For young people, routine is very important. In fact, I would say for most of us, routine is important. Many young people in the beginning of the pandemic were not able to go to school. They had to figure out how to learn virtually. They also were living in homes where their parents were under great stress. Many people lost their jobs or were worried about their jobs in the early days of the pandemic. There was economic uncertainty. People weren't sure how they were going to put food on the table. Many kids relied on school for food because food insecurity is a very common challenge in America right now. And without being able to go to school, the number of food insecure families actually increased. So you've got a circumstance where there's a lot of disruption to the stability that many children had in their lives. And that stress, adversely impacted the mental health of young people. Compound that with the fact that during times of stress, what do most of us typically do? We reach out to people in our life, right? We try to see a friend, spend time with a family member. In the early days of COVID in particular, that was a time you could not do that, right? Not just because you weren't in school, but because getting together with other people posed a risk of transmission. So it was a double hit, for young people when it came to their mental health. One bright side of it, if we have to find, as I do think it's important to try to find silver linings in tragedies, one silver lining is that I do think it has pulled back the curtain on the struggles that many young people have in a way that just did not exist before. Many people they thought, kids are fine, they're resilient, there's no problem, every generation goes through its changes, this generation will get through their changes as well. But I think it helped many people understand that, hey, there's something different going on here. Young people they have a unique set of challenges that they're facing that prior generations did not have to deal with. I did not grow up with the challenge of navigating social media. I didn't grow up with the ubiquitous phone, that was always at my side, and which interfered with lots of things from conversation to sleep. I didn't grow up within an environment where there was a constant presence of media in my life, right? Where I was constantly getting information thrown at me 24/7. When I wanted to turn off the news when I was younger, I turned off the TV, right? How do you turn off information in this day and age? And if a lot of that information is negative, if it's focused on everything that's wrong with the world, then you're constantly having this negative input into your life. And so I do think that this story that young people are being told about the world now is a skewed and I think heavily negative story. And I think that the technology and other stressors that they're having to manage, they're unique, and there's no guidance manual that comes with this. Parents are asking for one. Kids are actually asking for one too. And this is, I think, very interesting, Jim, is that I find that young people have a remarkable amount of insight into what's actually happening with them. And I find it actually helpful for me when I travel to just sit and listen a lot of times to what young people have to say. And they'll say, hey, look, I'm using technology all the time because everyone else is on it. I'm on social media because that seems to be where people are. So I feel I can't get off of it. But it doesn't make me feel good about myself. I'm constantly comparing myself to other people's best days and best versions of themselves online. But it also doesn't make me feel great about my friendships with other people. I think we're tight, and then I see everyone doing things without me, and it makes me feel left out. And so young people know that this is what's going on, but we cannot expect a young person today on their own to figure all of that out by themselves, which is why it's so important that we work together to help support young people through this. It's so important that we hold technology companies accountable to understanding the impact of these platforms on our youth. And it's why we've got to stay focused on this and recognize that until every child has the support and the help they need, until they no longer feel ashamed to ask for support when they need it, our job will not be done.
We've talked a lot about social media over the years, and particularly the impact of social media on young people's lives, and particularly their mental health. Do you think it's the comparison and sort of performative nature of social media that's critical to the stressors and to the mental health challenges, or is it other stuff?
Well, if I think about the conversations I've had with young people, but also with researchers around the country who have dug deeply into this, I think it's several effects. Like, one is the accelerated culture of comparison that exists online. And even though you and I know that what people are posting isn't always an accurate representation of their life, photos are altered, people are also selecting the best experiences, posting the happy moments, even though we know that, it still makes a lot of people feel worse about themselves. It's the experience of comparing your average days to other people's best days, and you always come up short in that regard. So I do think that culture of comparison is a huge factor here in eroding and chipping away at the self-esteem and sense of self that many young people need. But I think the other piece is just how ubiquitous a presence social media has in the lives of children, right? It's not like they're using it from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock every day, and then the rest of their time is free. It has infiltrated every part of their days, their evenings, even their nights, weekend time, vacation time. And what that means is that it also can compromise sleep. It can crowd out the time that you have in person with other people. It can distract you when you're actually in person having a conversation with somebody. Think about how many times we pick up our phone, we check social media, we check our inbox, etc., in the middle of conversation. So what it has done is both crowded out and diluted many of our interactions and taken the time away from practices like good sleep hygiene, which are an important part of our health and healing.
And when you talk to social media companies about this, which I do as well, what is the message that you want to deliver to the social media executives about their accountability and their role in not just creating some of the challenges, but also being part of the solution?
Well, I think when it comes to addressing the youth mental health crisis, we all have to ask ourselves, what can we do to help address this crisis? Policymakers have to do that, doctors and nurses, parents, community members, but that includes technology companies too. And it is not okay to develop a platform, put it out there, and just say, well, it's up to people how they use them, whether it has good effects or bad effects. That's not, our department. It's not our responsibility. We all, I think, have to take responsibility here in a moment like this and ask ourselves, are there things that we are doing, are there products we are building, services we are providing that are helping or hurting young people when it comes to their mental health? And if we don't know the answer to that, we've got to figure it out with actual data. And what I think that we really need to do when it comes to social media platforms in particular is, number one, we've got to ensure that there is data transparency. We would never take a medicine and put it out into the world and tell children to use it without data on the benefits and the harms, right? Yet somehow it seems that we have this grand national experiment that has been taking place. It's really a global experiment with social media. And yet where's the data helping us understand how it's impacting the mental health of kids, which kids in particular are most at risk, what kind of uses of social media are most hazardous to their health and well-being? We need to be able to see that data. Independent researchers tell me all the time that they can't access this data from the companies in the quality and quantity that they need to draw conclusions. That is something I think companies do. But there's one other piece to this, which is around safety standards. When I think about, the home that I live in, most of the products I have in my home had to meet some sort of safety standard before they were put out onto the market, before I was able to purchase them. Most of the items in my kitchen, in my living room, and this is true for most people. Yet how is it the case that we have allowed children and people, all people really, not just kids, to use these platforms which occupy so much of our lives without a real set of safety standards to govern their use, to help people make decisions? You see, the thing is, I think people should have the ability to make decisions in terms of how they spend their time, what they want to do, right? But I also believe people deserve the information, accurate information, about the benefits and harms so that they can make good decisions for themselves and for their children. And what parents continue to tell me around the country is that they just don't have that information. And they want to know why that's the case. And so this is where I think both data transparency, safety standards, these are really important to have in place to ensure that social media is a tool that does not adversely affect the mental health of young people. And I worry that for many young people, it is taking a toll on their mental health.